So I'm going to give you 2 slots now, an hour and a half about Nakamoto Consensus, the main blockchain protocol. And the first part of the talk will be telling you what this blockchain protocol is and defining some properties about it and asking the question of whether it actually is secure or not. And then in the second half, we'll see how to apply this protocol to first get better properties, stronger consensus protocols, or just different types of consensus protocols. And the first part is joint work with Lior Seaman and Abi Shulat, and the second part is with Elaine Shi. So before starting to tell you about the blockchain protocol, let's revisit the standard model in distributed systems and the task we would like the blockchain protocol to achieve. And the task we want to achieve is just consensus. This has sometimes been studied forever in distributed computing, but the setting in distributed computing is slightly different. So here the setting is we have a set of servers, let's say 10 of them. That's actually the typical scenario. In fact, often 10 is not 10, but 3. And these servers would like to agree on a linearly ordered log of transactions. So we have a bunch of transactions. We want people to be able to add to this list of transactions. And the property that everybody should be able to add to this list is called liveness. So whenever somebody wants to add a transaction, it eventually gets added there within some finite amount of time. And then the main property is that all these nodes should agree on what the set of transactions are. And as we'll see shortly, what it means to agree on a set of transactions is not completely trivial, because maybe one guy has gotten a transaction earlier than another. But looking ahead a little bit, what it means to agree is that this guy's list of transaction is a subset of his, or a prefix of his, or vice versa. So we might not exactly agree, but if I have something in my list, either you have it there, or you will get it there very shortly. Okay? And this has many names in distributed computing. State machine replication is one name, a linearly ordered log is another, or just consensus is a third. Now, the classic model in which this was considered, as I said, was we have this 10 set of nodes. Okay? And there's a few different assumptions that come with that. So we have a fixed set of players. Everybody knows who everybody is. And these guys are talking on authenticated channels. So I know who the other players are. And we typically also have this public key infrastructure in place. Now, with blockchain, we started talking about something that's called today the permissionless model. So the permissionless model, anybody can join the computation. And that's what makes this so different. So instead of having 10 nodes, here we have millions of nodes. Anybody can join. It's free for everybody. It's open. Okay? And nodes don't know even how many other nodes are out there. So that's a very big difference with the classic model. We don't know. There could be 1 million, could be 2 million. I don't know how many are out there. And nodes are coming and going. So I'm there, part of the protocol today, or I'm not there. Okay? And then the day after tomorrow, I join again. That doesn't make me bad. In the classic model, if I miss one round, if I'm not there tomorrow, that means that I'm a corrupted player. I did not participate in the protocol correctly. Here, we're saying, like, look, I'm here, then I go down to the subway, then I come back. I should still be fine, right? I'm not a bad player. I'm not a corrupted player. I was offline for a while. No, in the standard model, it's not. In the standard model, if I go down, that means that I'm corrupted, typically. There are some other models called this, in a asynchronous setting where that can be somewhat alleviated, but let's not go into that yet. Yeah.
Do nodes have localized information? They might not have information about the entire network, but they might know in a certain radius. Like
sure, they will need to somehow connect to the network, and so that definitely need to connect with it, and they need to know how to connect to the network. But other than that, yes, they don't know how many players are out there globally, and there's no way of authenticating or checking if somebody is actually a valid node or not. Anybody is valid here. Okay. So that's what makes this model a lot more challenging, and we're still really just at the beginning of understanding what can be done in this model. It's a very intriguing model. It turns out actually that before Nakamoto came up with this model, in my PhD thesis, I actually considered this model, but went in completely the wrong direction. So we considered this model and we proved a strong impossibility. Nothing can be done. Okay? If you don't have authentication, and we said it's impossible in the standard cryptographic model, and therefore we consider a weakened model of, we consider cryptography, secure computation, and we said we cannot have consensus, so forget about that, but we can design some notion of security without consistency. Okay? And that's the direction we went in, and you can prove even stronger impossibility results. We've done that with Elaine. We'll not go into that. But the main problem with consistency is that if you don't have authenticated channels, as we now know, you cannot check if somebody is a valid participant or not. So an attacker can just spawn all these extra nodes. This is called a Sybil attack, and they look the same as honest nodes. So if I have an honest majority of good players, doesn't mean anything because the attacker can just create billions of other nodes, and now the honest players are tiny in comparison with the honest-looking fake players. And that's called a Sybil attack. And that's unavoidable, it seems. Right? And then Nakamoto's amazing protocol came around, and it claims to achieve consistency. Right? And so how does it get around the previous Sybil attack problem? Well, the idea is to use something called proofs of work that most of you probably know about. So in order to join the computation, I need to perform some work. And now that's something that's hard to just copy. I cannot just fake lots of nodes because I need to, in order to participate in protocol, I need to work a lot. Okay? But that's not enough because it was an impossibility. Just because you do work doesn't remove the impossibility result. The main thing, and that's the main beautiful thing, is that he's changing the model, the right way to think about the problem. The way we typically think about protocols in cryptography and distributed systems is we assume a bound on how many players are honest. So we assume that half of the players around are honest. But in Nakamoto's model, what he instead assumed was that half the computing power in the world is honest. And that's what makes it possible to circumvent the impossibility. So what he was claiming was that his protocol is implementing. Oh, okay, I think this may be. So there. So what he was claiming was he came up with this beautiful protocol, and he was claiming that this actually implements consensus, or a public ledger, assuming a majority of the computing power in the world, or at least the computing power that's participating in this execution, is held by honest players. Okay? So that's the difference. Instead of saying a majority of the players are honest, a majority of the computing power is held by honest players. And under that assumption, he was claiming that, in fact, this protocol achieves a public ledger, and indeed we get these two properties of consistency. So let's recall them again because we'll hear them many times. Consistency was that everybody sees the same history, roughly, of transactions, and liveness that everybody can add transactions. So let me mention there are actually two amazing things about this claim. So the first one is, of course, that that's what we're interested in here, is that it overcomes this permissionless issue. It enables achieving consensus in a permissionless setting. But there's another thing, actually, and that's potentially less discussed. In this distributed system, there's this very famous impossibility result saying that you cannot achieve consensus unless you have 2/3 honest players. And here he's claiming it with just 1/2 honesty. Okay? And it turns out that this assumption, switching from fraction of honest players to computing power, also changes that bound. So going up, like, the resilience goes up from 1/3 to 1/2. And it actually relies on the same intuition. In order to prove this impossibility result, that requires kind of copying what a good player does. And copying what a good player does now is not free in this model because it requires performing the good player's computation, and that's why the bum becomes worse in this model. So it's another very intriguing property of this chained view. So that's all great, but the question we're going to address today is what does it actually achieve, right? There was a bunch of nice claims in Nakamoto's paper, but what is a blockchain, okay? And it's not exactly clear how to define the abstraction that we would like a blockchain to satisfy. So I'm going to try to go over that today. And the next thing is, does this protocol actually achieve consistency? Does it work? Nakamoto had a claim, and he had some analysis in a very simplified model saying that if the attacker tries a very particular attack, and I'll get back to this attack shortly, in that case it satisfies consistency. But of course, why would an attacker do that particular attack, right? Indeed, Aviv and Jonathan Samplinsky show that there are other attacks that don't fall into this model and that we need to think about. And indeed, they had a even more sophisticated and nice analysis showing that those type of attacks also couldn't work. But there are others outside of that. Okay? So what we like is to have an analysis that deals with all possible attacks. In fact, there was a very nice attack by Decker and Waterhofer showing that the protocol is not secure against 50%. They claim that there is an attack that works at 49.1%. Okay? And that was relying on the fact that there are network delays. And the attacker could exploit these network delays to get advantages in computing. So it kind of make honest players see slightly different things and try to confuse them, and then make use of the network delays in order to get more computing power. We'll get back to this type of attacks. So, my plan for the first part here is to tell you what a blockchain is. What do we want blockchain abstraction? What are some abstract properties we want the blockchain to satisfy? And then discuss a little bit about whether it satisfies them or not. So, what is a blockchain? Some of you have already heard this before. This is what it is. A bunch of blocks on a chain. So now you know. If someone asks you, it's very easy to explain. There. So a little bit more formally, as you know, we have this. We have a bunch of transactions that we would like to put together on this chain. So let's say that this is our current chain. How do we build a blockchain? Well, I have some new transactions that I would like to add to the blockchain. Eli wants to pay Vitalik some money. And what I should do as a miner, as a participant of this protocol, the participants are called miners. What I should do is I should take these transactions, I should take the end of the current list of blocks. I put it into this hash function, which is just any kind of crazy function. So I take the end of the chain, the new transactions, and just some random nonce, a random string. And this is called a puzzle solution. And I try to just hash this, hash. I use just different random strings until I find something that outputs something small. That starts with a bunch of zeros. Okay? This D is called the difficulty of the puzzle. And all the players, the participants, the only thing they're doing is they just continue doing this over and over again until they find a solution. Okay? That's all. So me as an honest guy, I see the end of the chain. I want to add some new transactions. What I do is just take the end, the transactions, a random string, and I try to hash it. If I get something good here, then I am a winner. Then that's called I found a new block. And if I found a new block, if I found something that is something that's smaller than the difficulty, in that case, I send it to everybody in the world. I say, I won, I found a new block, I mined a new block, we call it, and I let everybody know. And in that case, they extend their chain with this new thing, and from that point on, everybody else starts mining from that. Does it make sense? Okay. So as you see here, we have this parameter D, the puzzle difficulty. The way this is set today, the difficulty, is so that a block is found roughly every 10 minutes. So difficulty is adjusted so that when the whole world is mining, it takes roughly 10 minutes for this block to be found. Okay? So why 10 minutes, you might ask? We'll get back to that later. So this was just a choice that Nakamoto had. Now, this is essentially the whole protocol, but doesn't specify it. Okay, so the way I'm going to model it now is that this hash function is a random function. So the best way to find a solution, we'll assume, is by brute force search. Yeah?
What would be the alternative to the blockchain? You just described the architecture, so what's an alternative architecture?
Well, at this point in the permissionless model, this is all there is, right? When Nakamoto's came around. Well, I'll tell you what properties we want later on, and then we'll discuss alternatives. But at the moment, I'm trying to explain what Nakamoto's protocol was. Right? There's a lot of consensus protocols out there in the permission setting, but in permissionless setting, it was nothing else. Okay. So this doesn't fully specify the protocol yet, because if I join this protocol, I tried talking to network, and some of them say that this is the current chain, and another one says that this is the current chain. What should I do? Where should I continue mining?
Consensus.
What?
Maybe by consensus, like if you have a certain number of nodes, it's based on the majority.
Well, no. So what I should do here, what Nakamoto's protocol says is I should pick the longest chain. Okay? So, yeah. We don't care, okay? Like this is just a protocol. The protocol is, is this fair? Not, it's a computer. He doesn't have any notion.
But eventually they'll get lost, right?
Yeah, they get lost. So if I see this, what the protocol tells me to do is I'm going to continue mining from here. Now you're saying there's a bunch of stuff here that gets lost, like so bad. Tough luck, okay? The protocol tells me pick the longest one, continue mining from there, okay? If they're equal, very good point. There are two things that are equal length. What should I do? The protocol says, whatever I see first, I like it better. Okay, first impressions matter. If something comes after, I ignore it. So I only change my mind if I see something longer. And this is it. This is the whole consensus protocol. So I look at the network, I look at the longest chain that's out there, and I'm going to continue extending it by this very simple thing, just doing this. If I find a block, I send it on the network. So what I think is perhaps the most amazing thing about this protocol, it's so incredibly simple. As a consensus protocol, it's nuts. It's like 2 lines of code. And all these other consensus protocols, in the classic setting that we consider, they're much, much more complicated. They require 20 pages to describe sometimes. Okay? This thing is 2 lines of code. So even if you don't care about the permissionless setting, it's just as a consensus protocol, it's kind of amazing how simple it is. Now, we got some good questions of what happens here with these forks. Okay. Now let's say, yeah.
If you go back one side, it's not the longest chain; it's the longest valid chain.
Let's not get into validity now. Yeah. Right, as a consensus thing, it doesn't really matter if it's valid or not. As a consensus, I just have a bunch of transactions. It's true that in the Bitcoin application, you check if it's valid or not. But here, as a consensus, I don't really care about it. You can specify it that way, like without validity. Okay, so we have this one chain. Eli paid Vitalik some money in Zcash. And now, Eli would like to double spend this transaction and pay me also. Here, okay? So how should he do it? Because if he manages now to pay me here and then make this longer, as we heard here before, then all of this is lost, right? And Vitalik doesn't get his money, and I get my money. Okay? So how can he do that? Well, the only thing he needs to do here, he needs to just find a longer chain. If he finds a longer chain, that's it. That's great. Then he has won, because then everybody's going to find his longest chain. Are you with me? Okay. So, the claim that Nakamoto had done was that this can happen, and this will happen, in fact, if transactions are toward F. But if the transaction is sufficiently deep, then it's unlikely that he will be able to find a longer chain. So if it's sufficiently far back in the chain, then it's unlikely that he will be able to outrun the rest of the world. In fact, if he has less than majority of power in the world, then he will just be slower at finding these transactions, right? And that's actually what Nakamoto showed. Nakamoto showed if all the attacker tries to do is try to mine a new block on the separate chain, he won't be able to outrun the system, the rest of the honest players. And it's very natural, right? It's like you have these two processes. This one has a higher probability of winning than this one. In the long run, it could be that I win a few more times in the beginning,